of the Catholic Church. Like if you think about the last 3 or 4 years in ministry, like we teach all the time about prayer. We'll teach people how to pray, but we don't typically actually just sit down with them and pray. And I don't mean just like an opening prayer at the beginning of the youth group or a closing prayer. I mean like actually praying with them, leading them through an experience of prayer time like you would have on your own, but just do it with them. I have found that it's only when I do that with a young person, with my own children even, when I sit down and pray with them, I'm now all of a sudden able to mentor them in prayer. I model what prayer looks like. I model how to connect with Jesus in relationship. And I'm able to help them discern. Like as I start asking them, like, what do you feel like God's saying in your heart? And they start sharing that. A lot of times I'm able to help them discern like what's actually God and what's just themselves, and even worse, sometimes what's the enemy, how's the enemy try to hijack their prayer. So prayer for and with, right? We need to be praying for the people that we minister to, but we also need to be praying with them and modeling prayer and leading them in prayer. We need to make a connection. One of the things that I have found, and this is why I'm talking with all the priest council this morning and trying to connect with all of our youth ministers and DREs and RCIA coordinators and catechists and parishes, a lot of people have not been staying connected with the people that they serve during the quarantine period. I mean, they've been sending out emails and, we've had to reschedule all of our First Holy Communions. We've had to reschedule confirmation services. But people aren't really connecting in relationship, right? Like an email and information is not connecting. That's just transmitting information. So when I say making a connection, it really needs to be, I think, a phone call and how are you doing? And then after the person gives their first answer, you ask again, no, really, how are you really doing? This has been tough. This has been a tough time. Like how are your kids doing? How are you doing? Are you struggling in any way? Is there anything that you need? Like some of those kinds of deeper questions, I just think in a lot of parishes around the country, they're not being asked. If you are doing those kinds of things in your parish, kudos to you. You're way ahead of the curve from what I'm seeing. There's a lot of organizations like Amazing Parish and Divine Renovation and Catholic Leadership Institute and Ascension Press. There's a lot of these big organizations. They're encouraging these kinds of things, but rubber meets the road, practical on the ground stuff. What I'm finding is that a lot of parish staff are incredibly overwhelmed with panic and fear themselves. They've been isolated and working from home and haven't even been at the parish. And so they're trying to juggle what their responsibilities at the parish are. And there's a lot of people that are actually panicked that they might lose their job. They're not sure if they're even going to have a job on the other side of all this. And so rightfully, they're experiencing a lot of fear and uncertainty. And so the last thing, kind of that they're thinking about is how are other people struggling, and so I'm just trying to raise awareness that I think there's a lot of struggling going on out there, and because nobody's asking any questions, I think a lot of people are feeling very isolated and very alone in the struggle. So making a connection, talking with teens, listening. A lot of times we just have to ask a question and then just listen, because when you give people permission to talk about how they're really doing and they know that you authentically want to listen, they're going to talk. They're going to open up. I have a little discipleship group that my wife and I lead in our parish, and I've been amazed. We've been doing Zoom sessions every week during the last 7-8 weeks, And we've had some of our best discipleship group sessions of the last couple of years. And these kids are just open up and talking about all kinds of things. And I've never once actually finished what we planned, because the conversation always gets derailed into talking about what's going on in them and how they're struggling with things. Which I think that's actually good. Like, you got to give permission to get interrupted from your curriculum to talk about what's really going on in their lives. With all of this stuff, though, I think you have to be careful. We're not counselors. We're not professional caregivers from the psychological and counseling side. So you got to know your limits. I would always say to volunteers, and I would always, encourage youth ministers to have kind of a 3-session rule. Like, if I'm talking with the same kid more than 3 times about the same struggle or the same issue, I'm now starting to counsel them, and I'm not their counselor. I'm their youth minister. I'm their spiritual companion, and I can walk with them as a mentor, but I can't do the counseling side. So if I've done 2 or 3 sessions talking about how depressed they are, or how much they're struggling with their anxiety, or how they're struggling with their sexuality or things like that, I probably want to start thinking about, is there a referral that I can make to a good counselor who can now walk with us? So I can continue to be the mentor, but now you're getting another resource engaged to help them, so that's where referrals come in. So why don't we open up to some questions and comments?
Jim, I'll start. Actually, thank you so much for sharing all this information about pastoral care with us. I really appreciate it. I got kicked off in the middle of the meeting, so I missed some of it, which also means the recording is going to be screwed up. So those of you who are on the call are benefiting from the fact that you're going to get the chance to see all of it. I'll start with the first question, and then to the youth ministers, if you have a question, put it in the chat box, or if it's like too long of a question or whatever, you just want to talk, just either raise your hand or type, hey, can you unmute me, and I want to open up the floor to youth ministers. But while people are typing in their questions, my first question is, what is, like, you've navigated quite a few crises in ministry over the last 25 years, Columbine being one of the biggest ones. And, you made mention of Columbine, and the ministry that Cabrini put forth during that time in Littleton was tremendous in terms of healing the community. What did you find was most important for you in terms of self-care in the state of these crises? So I think that's an important question for what do our youth ministers need to be doing for themselves during this time? And then everybody else, please write your questions in the chat box.
That's a great question. I think a lot of times self-care is a little bit misunderstood and is kind of misdirected. Because without a good understanding of what do I really need, self-care can look like, I need to go binge on Netflix. I need to go eat something. I need to treat myself to something. I need to, whatever. You can come up with 100 different things that we might gravitate to in just our own human inclinations. That's actually not really self-care. Self-care is really taking care of yourself with healthy things. And so one of the things that I've been blessed with is, first of all, my wife is an avid nutritionist, almost to an extreme, I guess. She's very active on Facebook. So if you ever friend my wife on Facebook, she's constantly putting recipes and making her own candles and making her own deodorant. And she does the weirdest things. But anyway, I love it, right? But one of the things that my wife is really good at is she constantly, like, when things get really tense, she kind of puts me on a body cleanse and starts talking to me about exercise and talking to me about sleep. And right, so taking care of myself actually looks like getting at least 7 hours of sleep every night. It means staying regular and consistent with exercise, because I really can't afford not to. Like if I allow the crisis to become all consuming, where I'm not doing those kinds of things, like I have learned over time that I thrive the best when I'm at an ideal weight, when I'm not suffering from injuries because I've let myself go, and I'm eating healthy, uh, and I'm praying. Like I look at some of those key things, and I don't know if that makes sense. Like the first couple weeks of this thing, I did what I'm sure everybody started doing. Like I had tons of time because I was staying at home. They weren't allowing us to come in here to the archdiocese, and we found a couple of shows on Netflix, and we started watching shows, all hours of the day. And I mean, I got through about 3 or 4 days of that kind of environment in our home, and every hour it seemed like information was changing and what we knew about the virus and what was going to happen. And I'll never forget the afternoon sitting in the living room. We were watching another show, and I just stood up and said, I can't do this anymore. Like this is just so unhealthy. I gotta go. And I went through on some running clothes and went on a 5 mile run. And it was kind of like a turning point during the quarantine thing for us, where I realized, okay, this isn't going to be a sprint. This thing could last for a long time, and it's not going to be over in a week. So I've got to plan for the long haul. And so anyway, in answer to Everett's question, uh, that's what I would encourage. Self-care has got to be doing the right things.
Thank you thanks for sharing that. I know that I really appreciate it. I was at the NCCYM conference in Tampa uh, back in, I guess it was 2018 at this point, and I really appreciated that they had workshops in the morning on just exercise, which I think was led by Joya Farmer, who's become kind of a health nut, and she was saying, "Hey, look, we need to take care of ourselves as ministers. I'm going to lead an exercise class at 7 a.m. in the morning at this youth ministry professional development conference." So, it can't be overstated that prayer and taking care of yourself, particularly in a time of crisis, is really important. Dave Ottaviani wants to know, how would you open a conversation with a teen that you feel may be struggling and possibly heading towards hurting themselves or deep depression?
Well, I would start. I mean, first of all, I think you got to have the relational connection with the kid to start getting into this kind of conversation, because otherwise they won't trust you. It is an unfortunate reality, I think, of the whole, just a sexual scandal and the safe environment culture that we're in today. Kids are very suspect of adults that are trying to be in a relationship with them, and I think parents are even more suspect of adults. Um, I think this is one of the cultural things that we really have to change in the church. And I'm pursuing it right now in my own archdiocese with our safe environment officer and all of our policies, around safe environment stuff. But, I think we have to be aware, like that is the landscape of reality. And so you have to be really careful not to cross boundaries or uh, get into things, that would begin to do that. So what I typically do is I try to talk with kids with a friend, so that it's less imposing, less uncomfortable, and you kind of spiral into intimacy. Does that make sense? Uh, like there's ways you kind of layer into deeper things. Like you first just start talking about information. Like anyone could talk to you about the quarantine, and anyone could talk about the pandemic. And you could actually lead a series of questions just around that topic, around so what have you been doing while you're on quarantine? What shows have you watched? How have you been filling your time? Like how are you doing with the whole quarantine period? How are your parents doing? Uh, you just ask questions like that, and if you're really actually interested and engaged in the conversation, and really listening to them, right? Which one of the things you have to be careful of is, I find this happens a lot with adults. Like when I'm mentoring other adults as they're, trying to help mentor them in doing relational ministry, a lot of adults are so nervous that they're not really listening to the kids. They're thinking about what they're going to say when the kid's done talking. And they'll come, so the kid's saying something and actually kind of starts bordering on a little bit of depth. And then the adult says something back to them that's just like out in left field and clearly not listening to what was just said. And I find myself looking at him like, where did that come from? Were you not listening to what the kid just said? So this is what I do with adult volunteers and youth ministers is I will get them into conversations with teenagers, and I'll kind of help prompt, get the conversation going, but then kind of let them drive, almost like driver's ed, I guess, a little bit. And at some point they're really steering and leading the conversation, and I can kind of mentor them sometimes after the fact or sometimes even during. But that would be the encouragement. It's like you really have to listen. Don't be trying to think about what you're going to say next or how you're going to respond or what's the next question you're going to ask. Just listen to what they say and respond organically. Respond to what you hear. And I think you'll find that kids are actually pretty open if they trust you. If they feel like they can trust you, they'll start to be pretty open with how they're struggling. I mean, they're not going to go into like deep depths in your first conversation, but um, in my experience, you build trust over time. You start opening up the doors to talk about deeper things, and at some point, you can ask harder questions, right? Like, are are you thinking about hurting yourself? You sound really depressed. Uh, have you had thoughts of hurting yourself? Like that would be a question that I've asked a number of kids. Uh, my one of the kids that's in our discipleship group, actually just a few months ago, before the whole COVID thing happened, we had a session one night, and this girl, like for a number of weeks in a row, she just did not seem herself. And um, and so at the end of the session, it was open in a room, but I was kind of off to the side with her, and I just said, are you doing okay? And she looked at me and she said, I'm fine. And she's like, why do you ask? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. You seem kind of down. That's all. And it's like, I guess I would want you to know, like, if you ever were not okay, I'd want you to know that this is why we're together. This is why we're in this group, is we're here for you. We're for you. Like if you're struggling with something, I'd want you to feel safe that you could ask some questions or you could reach out for help. And she was like, well, what do you mean I don't seem like myself? And I just said, look, we love you, we care about you. You seem kind of down, and I'm just reaching out to make sure you're okay. And then all of a sudden you could see like the little tear in the corner of her eye, and she said, well, I'm not okay. And you could tell she was testing the waters, right? Like, if I say that, is it gonna blow up here, And so I just looked at her and it's like, do you want to talk more about that? And then she just almost lost it, and she said, I don't know if I can. But and it's like, well, are you safe? And she's like, what does that mean? And I said, well, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And she said, every day. Like, bam, right? She's not going home right there until I talk to her mom or her dad. Uh, but I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I noticed, I was aware. I noticed, over a couple of weeks, a certain emotional demeanor. And then I at some point I navigated a conversation in a way that I could gently push a little bit into what I was seeing as some pain, and try to see if she would be receptive to some help. Within 2 days, she was committed to a hospital. She was incredibly suicidal. She's actually over the last several months has gone through 2 6-week rounds in intense therapy in the hospital. She got out for about a week and then went right back in for another 6-week round. And now on the other side of all that, it's actually doing markedly better. She just we were just celebrating her the other night because she after she got out of the hospital the second time, one of the things she loves to do is run, and they had a big race, a marathon race that was supposed to happen that got canceled because of the coronavirus, and she ran it. It was a half marathon, but she decided she was going to get up one morning and run the half marathon, even though the race wasn't happening. And so we were all celebrating her for her accomplishment and pushing through to something that she really desired, so.
Thanks, Jim. That's a great response. We're coming up on the end, but there was one more question. Maybe you could answer it quickly. Kathy says, "Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. How would you recommend reaching out to the whole family during this time?"
Well, one of the things that we're encouraging here is direct phone calls. And I know that sounds really overwhelming, but there's ways that you can do it. You can get the Knights of Columbus, you can get the Ladies Auxiliary, you can get different clubs or different groups in the parish that have, a number of people. In our parish, we use the men's ministry. There's like 300 men that meet every week on Thursday morning, really, really early. The group hasn't been meeting during this quarantine period. But there's just lots of men in that group, and most of the Knights of Columbus are involved in that. But that group took the parish roster and just divided it all up, and about every 10 to 14 days, so every week and a half or 2 weeks, everyone was calling everyone on their list. So it wasn't just a one-time check-in. It actually became something that was sustained. But the questions were pretty simple. Hey, just check it in. How are you doing? How are you holding up with this whole quarantine period? Has there been anything that's happened? Like, has somebody gotten sick? Has anyone lost a job? Like any significant things that it would be good for Father to know about, so that we can be praying for you. And then third, is there anything you need? And like the responses that have come from those simple reach outs and questions, have been really substantial. Now, granted, once you start asking the question, then you start to feel like, well, what if we can't meet the needs? What if somebody says they need something and we can't do anything about it? There's all kinds of, and again, there's just all kinds of people that want to help. And there's all kinds of people who have needs. And sometimes we just have to facilitate connecting the dots. I don't have to meet all of those needs. The men's ministry doesn't have to meet all those needs. Even the person making the phone call doesn't have to try to meet those needs. But if we can make the needs aware somewhere where other people can have access to what the needs are, then you just connect those dots, right? So.
Thank you, Jim. So really appreciate that you joined us today and you shared your expertise.
Yeah, great being with you.
Yeah, thank you we'll pray for you and your family during this time. Again, is there anything that you want to plug in terms of your own ministry, or where people can get in contact with you if they have a further question or they just want to follow your ministry?
Yeah, I have my ministry is called Impact Center. It's just impactcenter.com, but nothing really to plug or anything like there. And I work for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, so you can find me on the website here at the Archdiocese.
Great. Thank you, Jim. We really appreciate you joining us. For the youth ministers on the call, like 3 quick public service announcements. Number 1, we expect that there will be a job posting for the Diocese of Palm Beach for the Director of Youth Young Adult Ministry sometime, hopefully within the week. We're just finalizing details on that. If you have an interest in that position, the job description will be going out this week.
Everett, I got to jump off, okay?
Okay. Thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Great seeing you all.
Two, next week's session was scheduled to be with Annie Grandel, who is the coordinator of Y Disciple and works for Net Ministries. She has a lot of expertise in small group ministry. We've actually pushed that off for 2 weeks because Annie informed me that she is waiting for her kids' school year to end and will have a lot more flexibility. She said she doesn't want to have kids climbing all over her during the session. So we're going to do that one on June 9th. So next week's speaker is to be determined. But we really appreciate, again, that you join us. I've got a couple of people that I just need to finalize with in terms of upcoming sessions. And we hope to have, again, we're going to have a person in place here to put long-term ministry to you in place over the summer and get things going in the Diocese of Palm Beach. The third thing that occurred to me real quick is that there is a conference that Jason Everett was with us last week, and he was plugging his Love Life conference, which is this upcoming weekend, Chastity Conference, and there's 80 plus speakers, etc. It occurred to me that there are a lot of virtual conferences that are going on right now. There was one last month. There was a Theology of the Body 2 weeks ago. The subject matter of this upcoming virtual conference is really teen friendly. In fact, it's really got a lot of good content for teens and for parents. The premium passes that they offer for these virtual conferences, which is really where they make any kind of money, they're about $50 for premium pass. And it occurred to me that with the premium pass, you get talks on these subject matters indefinitely. So all the talks from the conferences that you have available to you. And I was like, boy, that is a really cheap way to get great video content for your youth ministry for the next year and a half. So it's just something to put in the back of your mind. I know that there's going to be an upcoming like pro-life conference. I'm sure there will be eventually be a virtual youth conference. Look at those virtual conferences and say, hey, is there subject matter here that might be worth a budget or investment? The reason why I bring that up is Jim and I worked on Y Disciple together for several years, and we spent probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars putting together like video content for the Y Disciple program. And the fact that you could have some of this content available to you for $50 is just a huge steal in terms of ministry content to have. So something to put on the back burner for you to think about. Otherwise, we'll be here next week on Tuesday. Zoom meetings, again, appreciate it. If you need anything, shoot me an email. I'll put my email in my personal email in the chat box real quick, and know of our prayers for you and your ministry.